Welcome back to Liberty Bites on the Think Liberty Network. I hope everyone had a good Veterans Day. And remember that the best way to honor vets is to stop supporting endless wars. I'm your host, William Gadsden. You can follow me on Twitter at William_Gadsden and follow Think Liberty on Facebook, Twitter, or whatever your favorite social media outlet is. You can also follow me on Facebook at William Gadsden Political Commentator. Give us a follow and a like for updates on new episodes and more. We also have a Patreon now, so if you'd like to support our work, check it out at patreon.com/ThinkLibertyPatrons. Okay, we're going to dive into one of my personal favorites in terms of Supreme Court cases, D.C. v. Heller. Why is this one of my favorites? You guessed it, it has to do with guns. More specifically, this was a 2008 case that radically changed how the government could restrict firearm rights. But before we get into the nitty-gritty of this case, let me ask y'all something. How many of you run into the anti-gun argument of, it says a well-regulated militia? This argument often leads to statements like, the modern militia is the National Guard, so Guard members are the only ones protected by the Second Amendment. So this case blows that entire argument wide open, which I'll explain in a second. The other thing that you have to know before we get into this case is the difference between may issue and shall issue states. So in the majority of the U.S., if a firearm owner wants to get a carry permit for their firearm, they have to go through the local or state government to do so. While there is now a growing number of constitutional carry states that don't require a concealed weapons permit, most states still do. In a shall-issue state, the law says that someone applying for a concealed weapons permit must be issued the permit as long as they meet the standardized requirements for ownership and control of the permit. The chief law enforcement officer of that area doesn't get a say in it otherwise. In a may-issue state, the law says that the chief law enforcement officer of that area can reject issuance of a concealed weapons permit to a citizen based on their own discretion. Now, obviously, y'all are a smart audience. We know that every gun law is an infringement, but this is the world that we live in. So finally, let's keep in mind that the 2008 D.C. v. Heller case is just one in a long line of Supreme Court cases that orbit around gun laws in D.C. specifically, stretching from 2003 to 2017, starting with Parker v. D.C. The Heller case is just the one with the highest visibility. If you're at all interested in firearm rights, I highly encourage you to look into this series of cases in depth, as well as, of course, continuing to study this case in particular. Anyway, let's get on with it. So in 1975, the District of Columbia outright banned handguns and subsequently added numerous restrictions on the storage and maintenance of rifles and shotguns in the D.C. area. Most notably, they had to be stored unloaded at all times and with a trigger guard on it. After a series of related, a trigger lock. After a series of related cases started making its way through the courts in the D.C. area, in steps one Dick Anthony Heller. Now, Heller was a licensed security officer in the D.C. area, so he obviously carried a weapon while he was on duty in federal buildings around the city. But due to the handgun ban in D.C., he was not allowed to carry off-duty, or even own one to keep in his own home. So he had an issue with this, and he took it to court. It's also worth noting that he approached the NRA to help support him in this case, but they declined, just putting it out there. So in district court, the case was dismissed. It was then bumped up to the Court of Appeals. This is where it starts to get very interesting. The Court of Appeals rules that both the handgun ban and the regulations on rifles and shotguns are unconstitutional, noting that the Second Amendment was in practice before the ratification of the Constitution, and when the Constitution was ratified, it was clear that the intent of the Second Amendment was to provide a source of hunting and self-defense for the average citizen. As handguns are considered arms, the ban is unconstitutional. Furthermore, and this is important, the Court of Appeals ruled that since the strict regulation on storage of rifles and shotguns amounted to incapacitating an owner's ability to use them, it too was unconstitutional. Woo! I mean, this court knocked it out of the park. But this case obviously isn't done yet. The Supreme Court was petitioned to hear the case, and they accepted. But the petition itself was slightly rewritten when compared to that in the Court of Appeals, framing the question in the context of membership in the militia, as in, do individual citizens have a right to own and keep firearms outside of being involved in the militia. So the stage is set. Before we get into the good, the bad, and the ugly here, remember the intro episode I did on this series where I talked about the different political philosophies behind different interpretations of the Constitution? So in this case, Justice Scalia makes it quite clear which philosophy he stands behind, saying, quote, "The Constitution was written to be understood by the voters. Its words and phrases were used in their normal and ordinary as distinguished from technical meaning." Referencing U.S. v. Sprague and Gibbons v. Ogden, these are particularly the strongest and clearest terms that have been used by a Supreme Court justice to clarify an interpretive philosophy. This case is also a fantastic example of several of the concepts that I went over in the first episode in addition to interpretive philosophy. Precedent, historical context, even grammar comes into play in this majority opinion. That being said, while the difference between the prefatory clause and the operative clause in the Second Amendment is incredibly important to the majority opinion in this case, we're already running a little long on this episode, so I'll let you look up that part on your own. Basically, Scalia takes the entire Second Amendment apart and analyzes it literally word by word and ties it into historical precedent and context in order to strengthen his argument. As a bonus, he also clarifies that the word arms is not restricted to any particular type of weapon. It is all-encompassing to include anything that a private citizen could use to defend themselves. Anything, including firearms. Because the Second Amendment, just like the Bill of Rights, is meant to be timeless, operating outside of whatever the current technology available is. I mean, in this ruling alone, Scalia takes the entire country to school in his in-depth explanations of English, history, and philosophy, going above and beyond just defending the Second Amendment. It's a beautiful piece of law practice right here. The important thing to note here is that the militia clause is separate from the clause referring to ownership. Therefore, there is no binding relationship between the ownership of firearms and membership in the militia. Oof. All right. Let's get into the good, the bad, and the ugly of this case. Okay, so the good. Scalia makes it clear that in the majority opinion that the citizen's right to keep and bear arms is unquestionably recognized and protected by the Constitution and is supported by several hundred years of history and philosophy, from medieval Europe to the American colonies. The government cannot outright restrict a law-abiding citizen from owning a firearm and keeping it in his or her home. In short, he states, quote, "As the quotations earlier in this opinion demonstrate, the inherent right of self-defense has been central to the Second Amendment right. The handgun ban amounts to a prohibition of an entire class of arms that is overwhelmingly chosen by American society for that lawful purpose. The prohibition extends, moreover, to the home, where the need for defense of self, family, and property is most acute. Under any of the standards of scrutiny that we have applied to enumerated constitutional rights, banning from the home the most preferred firearm in the nation to keep and use for protection of one's home and family would fail constitutional muster." Unquote. So pretty solid, but there's also a bad streak in this majority opinion. Scalia also writes, quote, "Like most rights, the right secured by the Second Amendment is not unlimited." Oof. So he goes on to say that, quote, "Although we do not undertake an exhaustive historical analysis today of the full scope of the Second Amendment, nothing in our opinion should be taken to cast doubt on long-standing prohibitions on the possession of firearms by felons and the mentally ill, or laws forbidding the carrying of firearms in sensitive places such as schools, government buildings, or laws imposing conditions and qualifications on the commercial sale of arms, and that, quote, we think that limitation is fairly supported by the historical tradition of prohibiting the carrying of dangerous and unusual weapons," unquote. Now, I don't know about you, but I thought the entire point of a weapon was to be dangerous. But I've seen some pretty unusual weapons, so that's fair. Unfortunately, these additions to the majority opinion left a certain amount of wiggle room for anti-gun activists inside and outside of the government to justify their own agendas. And as expected, they exploit them at their every opportunity. For the ugly, I want to go over a brief summary of the two dissenting opinions in this case, made by Justice Stevens and Justice Breyer. Justice Stevens states that, quote, neither the text of the amendment nor the arguments advanced by its proponents evidenced the slightest interest in limiting any legislature's authority to regulate private civilian uses of firearms. Specifically, there is no indication that the framers of the amendment intended to enshrine the common law right of self-defense in the Constitution. Wow. So this is a very Hamiltonian view of the Constitution. The idea that if it isn't specifically written in the Constitution, then that means the government has carte blanche regulatory potential with it. Justice Breyer argues that the purpose of the Second Amendment in terms of use within a militia and in terms of self-defense are sometimes intertwined with one another and are therefore inseparable. He says, quote, to assure 18th century citizens that they could keep arms for militia purposes would necessarily have allowed them to keep arms that they could have used for self-defense as well. But self-defense alone, detached from any militia-related objective, is not the amendment's concern. He goes on to say that, quote, the protection the amendment provides is not absolute. The amendment permits government to regulate the interests that it serves. Thus, irrespective of what those interests are, whether they do or do not include an independent interest in self-defense, the majority's view cannot be correct unless it can show that the district's regulation is unreasonable or inappropriate in Second Amendment terms. So basically, as far as the dissenting opinions are concerned, which, by the way, included the support of Ruth Bader Ginsburg, do not believe that the average American citizen has a right to own firearms, regardless of what the intended purpose of it is. Anything from sporting applications to self-defense. In fact, they go even further to say in one of the dissenting opinions that I just read that self-defense is not an enshrined right in the Constitution. These people are saying that you as an American citizen do not have the right to self-defense. That should send a chill down the spines of every single one of us. So when it comes down to it, it isn't a question of reasonable regulation or common sense gun control. It ultimately comes down to the fact that they don't think you should be able to have guns at all. Keep that in mind next time someone uses one of the popular anti-gun catchphrases like that. All right, so this was a long episode, but we went over a lot of great stuff here. I hope you enjoyed listening to it as much as I enjoyed putting it together. Thanks for listening, and in our next episode, we'll be going over the most famous recent Supreme Court case that I think most of us probably followed as it happened, National Federation of Independent Business v. Sebulus, a.k.a. the Supreme Court case that saved Obamacare. I hope you'll join us next time to become more liberty-centered with us. I'm William Gadsden with Think Liberty.